Hello again, everyone. You're joining us for another episode of Executive Platform's Blueprint podcast series. My name is Geoff Micks. I'm head of content and research. My guest today is Betty Thompson of Booz Allen Hamilton. She hosted a themed lunch discussion today on the topic of the mental health crisis, what companies can do, what HR professionals can do, and of course, a topic like that is something of interest to a lot of people, but you can only have 10 people around a lunch table talking about it. She has very generously offered to share some of the insights from that conversation with us. Betty, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
Why don't we start off with why you picked this as the topic of your lunch? You have some editorial control over this. You can host a conversation on anything. Why mental health?
I think the last couple of years have proven to us how important it is to have resources available to our employees to support them during these events that continue to come up, whether it's around the murder of George Floyd, it's natural disasters that happen, humanitarian aid that's needed, the war that we're seeing, between Israel and Hamas. Those things create a lot of anxiety and problems for employees and create mental health issues that they have to deal with. That was also preceded by all of the events during COVID and the isolation and all of the needs that employees had to, get more support. And so we have found it to be incredibly helpful. We have a very large veteran population. And veterans, we were doing work with the VA on veterans' mental health, and we thought, well, we should be doing that for ourselves given the number of employees that we have that are veterans and how common it is for people to be dealing with mental health issues. We wanted to get rid of the stigma and address that to the degree that we could, and that was the first thing that we tried to do, was to have it be part of the conversation and for it to be okay to not be okay.
Absolutely. So you chose this topic. We put it up on a website and on an app, and on a first-come, first-served basis, the HR professionals attending this event could say, that is something I want to talk about for an hour with people who all opted in and care about it. When you knew that was going to happen, did you have thoughts about what kind of people and organizations might be part of the conversation? I'm not looking for you to name any names, you understand, but big companies, small companies, particular industries, who was there?
Well, I had no idea who would show up. I was hoping I just wouldn't be by myself. But it was companies that were small, 500 employees. There were companies that had thousands, similar to Booz Allen. We have about 33,000 employees. There were some that had people all over the world. There were people that were more of a franchise model, so they didn't have as much control over what was offered to those employees and have as much contact with them. So it really was a pretty diverse group that were part of the conversation.
And I think that speaks to the universality of this
Exactly.
challenge. So why don't we start off with maybe, as you think about what people brought to that conversation, did something surprise you?
I was surprised that some people felt like they couldn't address the stigma, that it was just sort of an off-limits kind of a topic. It wasn't, something that they could do. They could put the resources there, but they weren't going to be able to address the stigma. So we had a lot of conversations about how to do that. I talked about what we did at Booz Allen. Others talked about what they did at their companies to make it more of a supportive conversation and for it to be okay. I think the other thing that surprised me was that it was such a rich topic for people, and that there were a lot of companies doing a lot of really great things.
I can imagine as an HR professional, it has to feel like you're making a difference when you help people with something that personal, that immediate, that important.
Well, it's funny because one of the obstacles I faced when we were introducing it was and this was 10 years ago, so it wasn't a very common topic, was the most resistance came from my own team, the HR team. And we talked about that because HR people are dealing with people's feelings all the time and their emotions and their reactions. And we're often the first stop when there's some event that happens to our employees. And I think the reaction that I got from my team was because they were already dealing with so much, they didn't want more being added to their responsibilities as it related to that. But it was something that people felt like HR does naturally, but it was broadening that to the families of our employees and to things that weren't necessarily work-related.
When I hear that, I think of a trend that I hear a lot, especially since the end of the pandemic. HR organizations more and more have to think of their employees as whole people, right? It's not what they're doing within their working hours. They have other things that matter in their lives that they bring to work, especially when it comes to mental health. So good for your organization for being ahead of the curve 10 years ago, and I can only imagine that's accelerated since. Did that resonate with the group?
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the folks at the table said, well, are the mental health issues because of work or are they outside of work? And the way we talked about it was actually if they were at work, it would be easier to solve. We'd have some control over it. If there was stress or there were, undue, deadlines, things like that, we could probably deal with it. And I think we, for the most part, agreed that it was mostly things that were happening outside of work. And so that was why it was so important to make it about the whole person, because whether they bring those problems to work, they're coming to work and those problems are still with them. And so they're not going to be as productive. I always say, having 4 kids of my own, that you're never happier than your unhappiest child. And so you're bringing that to work, and it's not, you're not going to be at your best if you've got those things going on and you don't know how to deal with them.
Now, the title that you chose is, what can companies do? What can HR do? I have to think, and I think you mentioned it, some of the people at that table probably came hoping to hear an answer because maybe their organization is well behind where they want to be.
Yeah.
What advice did you have for companies at the start of that journey?
One of the things was opening up the conversation. So what we did was we had a large meeting where some of our very brave senior leaders stood up and told their story. Some of them were about their own struggles with mental health and things they had dealt with their whole life. Some were about their children. One woman talked about her child and the challenges that they've had. And another was about themselves, but it was an event that caused a traumatic response. And so we had them stand up and talk about that. And we talked at the table today about how important it was for leaders, because everybody looks at them and thinks, oh, they're perfect. They've got, they've been able to do all these things. But to really be that vulnerable and show that, they too have had to deal with these things. And it's okay to talk about it. And so putting that out there, I think, is the first thing to try to drive the stigma away. The other is to make sure that you really have a way for employees to access the resources that you have. We talked about, yes, when they come to onboarding, they get all this information about all the wonderful things that the company does for them. Well, guess what? They didn't have an event come up within the first couple of days after starting. Probably came up years later, and they don't remember what you told them about the resources that the company had. So finding ways to make sure that it's easy for them to navigate. We set up a customer care center, not a customer care center, an employee care center, where employees in time of need can call that number, and there are trained people that can understand what it is they're dealing with. They're not therapists, but they have pharmaceutical backgrounds, they have therapy backgrounds, social workers, that they can say, okay, well, this is probably something that would be better handled by EAP. Let me look at if you have what kind of coverage you have on your insurance. Maybe it would be better for you to go this route. You should talk to your doctor about these kinds of things. So having a way for them to navigate the resources that we already have is really important. And that definitely resonated with the people at the table, because they all felt like they were doing a lot for their employees, but their employees didn't necessarily, especially in time of crisis, think about how to what are all of those resources. So having a place to go really helps. And then it's all about culture too, having a culture where people know that you care, getting to know them, being vulnerable with them, so that if they have an issue, they know that they can let you know about that. And again, that goes back to the stigma. But some of the other things that we've done is we've had a mental health summit every year where we bring in experts, people to talk about it. We also have people do their own testimonials about what they've been dealing with. We also created some support groups using outside professionals, some of our EAP resources, to facilitate those conversations, whether it was there was one that was on children with addictions, and how as a parent you're dealing with all of that. And again, there's a lot of stigma attached to that, right? Am I a terrible parent because I have a child that has a drug addiction? Those kinds of things. People that have had losses in their life, death. We've had groups that have formed around there. So any way that you can find to show your employees that you do recognize that they're dealing with a lot of different things other than work, and that we want them to have a safe place at work where they can talk about those things and be supported.
Now, you touched on making resources available for people, and I'm really interested in that because I think that's one of those things that it can feel a little overwhelming. If you're head of an HR organization, there's so many places to start. Could we talk a little bit about maybe some of the work that your organization is doing to give people options and put things in front of them and maybe even improve some of those options?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that we found, especially during the time after George Floyd's murder, was that we didn't have a very diverse set of people or resources in our EAP program. So we challenged them with getting more diverse providers within their EAP network, which was very helpful and very responsive to the needs of our employees. But there is a shortage in general, and there certainly is a shortage in diverse providers. And it's something that was alleviated a bit during COVID because we were able to use telemedicine. And a lot of the regulations about somebody living in one state and being treated by somebody in another state were suspended, if you will, during COVID. Well, once COVID was over, many of them went right back in place. So a provider that you were seeing in another state, telemedicine-wise, after COVID, you no longer can see. That can be very disruptive to somebody's ability to get the help that they need. And there's a lot of places in this country where they don't have enough providers. So we're working with, trying to talk to regulators and other people on the Hill and so forth to talk about the need to break those silos down and make telemedicine a viable part, continue to be a viable part of mental health providers.
What a fantastic thing to do. And I think, when you come up with the title of, what can companies do, what can HR do, what can industries do for each other? Because that's something that, when you move the needle on that issue, it's not going to be just for your company. It's going to be for everybody.
Exactly.
We've covered a lot in this conversation. And again, I am fascinated with the idea of these themed lunches. It's 10 people who opted in, who really spent an hour talking about what was going on with them. If there were one or two key takeaways that, hey, if everybody who's listening to this episode had been part of that lunch, what are some things that maybe you would highlight and you think they could apply to their own work in this space? Maybe just give them a taste of the conversation that you had in a nutshell.
I would say that there are outside organizations that can come in and train some of your HR people, some of the other people that we call first responders, so that they can be a resource to the managers, to the colleagues, to somebody who sees something. The other is to have some kind of training that says, here are some signs that you should look for, especially if you're a manager. We worked with an organization called Give an Hour, and they had just a very simple business card that had 5 facial expressions on it. And it said, when you see these signs, ask, how are you doing? One of the women at the table today talked about, people always say, so how are you? And she said she has found a big difference when you say, how are you feeling? So just a turn of the words lands differently with somebody, and it's not that automatic, oh, I'm fine. How am I feeling? People dig a little deeper. And so I think just some of those little things to let people know that you care.
I think that's such a easy and valuable takeaway to offer. I really appreciate you sharing some of your time with us, Betty.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
You've been listening to another episode of Executive Platform's Blueprint Podcast. I've been Geoff Micks. Let's do it again soon.